In preparing the slideshow for today, I was thinking to myself, how is it that I might best display my work in the various countries in which my husband Tim and I lived? But then as I began to look at each one of the photographs, I began to think, well, you know, the better question really might be, how can I best reveal the Lord's presence and guidance during the years that Tim and I served in the mission field? As you look at this photo, it's a Bangladeshi kitchen. And like so many of us, or I think many of us here in the U.S., the kitchen is the focal point for our families. And as you can see, this Bengali woman is seated there. And if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see what looked like some sticks wrapped with whatever. Well, actually, they're wrapped in cow dung mixed with grass around sticks that are laid to dry in the sun, and then that is used to fuel the fire for cooking. This is not only the woman's kitchen, this is nearly her entire home. If you look just behind her, you'll see a wooden platform, and she would lay a mat upon that and sleep there with her 2 daughters. Early in our years with Habitat for Humanity, the Lord laid it upon both Tim's and my heart, the absolute conviction that every human being deserves a simple, decent, safe, and healthy place to live. And this woman here in Bangladesh was certainly evident of one for whom we were willing to work that she might have a good, decent, safe shelter for herself and for her daughters. Another Bengali woman. And as a grandmother, I now completely understand that smile on her face as she looks upon her little granddaughter. Families, we've learned worldwide, it doesn't matter where you live. We've been to outer Mongolia, in all honesty. It doesn't matter where you are. Families and that great, wonderful tie that binds them together is prevalent throughout our world. These two are Bengali women, and they work with a program called The Widow's Friend. And this program was started by a Presbyterian woman named Faith Willard out of Cape Cod. And Faith went to that nation shortly after it had fought its war of independence. And she worked with women, primarily because women who did not have a man, they had just fought a war of independence, 3 million citizens killed. And a woman without a man was really left to her own devices in a country where the literacy rate was 29%. And so if she didn't have a husband or a son or a brother or a father, she was left to prostitution or to begging. And so Faith Willard started an income generation program, fine needlepoint stitchery for these women. And while they were there, they were actually given 2 decent meals a day. The program expanded to include orphanages, to include a school for the deaf, a prenatal clinic. Tim and I met the young nurse who ran the prenatal clinic, and she opened up a package, much like a piece of copy paper that had been folded down into quarters. And as she opened it, we were able to see a piece of string, 2 cotton balls, a package razor blade, a gauze pad, and a belly band. And these packages were given to pregnant women to give to midwives. They cost 25 cents US. And by giving that packet to the women, cotton balls to wipe the baby's eyes after the baby was born, the gauze pad to staunch any bleeding that might be occurring, the sterile razor blade to cut the baby's umbilical cord, and a piece of string to tie it off. And by giving that package to women, it cut the incidence of tetanus by 75%. I don't know if you've ever seen a baby dying of tetanus, but we have. And it was because the midwives would take bamboo and sharpen it and then cut the baby's umbilical cord. Bamboo is filled with tetanus spores. I tell you, God is indeed at work in our world. You'll hear a lot more of these tears. I can't speak without them coming. The next slide is in Haiti. This is called jalousie. Jalousie in French Creole or Haitian Creole means jealousy. This is a slum. Looks pretty, doesn't it? With all those pretty colored, brightly or pastel colored homes. But it's a terrible slum. And the wealthy of Pétionville, the nearby town, didn't like the sight of these drab concrete homes. And so they sent paint into the slum and said, paint your home because we don't want to see the ugly gray slab. Again, it goes back to that conviction that says every human being deserves a simple, decent, safe, and healthy place to live. The next slide is also of Haiti. And these are children at the program, the school where Tim and I worked, called CONASPE, an acronym for the National Spiritual Council of Churches in Haiti. The director, Patrick Villiers, started the program many years earlier after the ousting of Baby Doc Duvalier. You might remember the Duvaliers, terrible dictators, Papa Doc and Baby Doc. And Papa Doc had died. Baby Doc was ousted in, I think, 1987. Protestants had to keep a very low profile in country, predominantly Roman Catholic. The saying in Haiti is 93% Catholic, 6% Protestant, 1% other, and 100% voodoo. But Patrick Villiers and 50 other Protestant pastors came together thinking they might be able to present a united front for Protestant pastors within the nation. This school where Tim and I worked had what's called a classical study program. That's the young people you're seeing here, what we would call grades pre-K to 12. But a 12th grader, they call them philo students. A 12th grader could be anywhere from 28, 29, 30 years old because students go to school as they had money. Tim and I had a young woman named Nicole, who worked for us. She cleaned house for us, did laundry for us, and the 4 years that she was with us gave her enough money to finish her schooling, high schooling, at the age of 31. A mission team from Indianapolis came in to the country, and they wanted to bring a variety of musical programs to the classical studies program. And here you can see handbells, children's handbells that were brought. And the young people are just amazing. Within a half hour of those bells being laid in their hands, the young people were playing like old pros. I have it on video in case you want to see it. This is a church in India, and if you'll take note, I'm standing there at the pulpit with a dear friend, Franklin, and Tim sitting off to the right. Men are seated on the floor to the right, and women seated on the floor to the left. We couldn't find the photo of Nepal, but it makes us very much think of the Pathan Christian Church in the capital city of Kathmandu, the largest Christian church in the city. When we were driven there by a dear friend, Perry Diane Fonderlin, who had himself been thrown into prison because he had converted to Christianity while he was visiting a church in Youngstown, Ohio, which happened to be the church where my best friend was married, and he accepted Christ. But when he returned to Nepal, he was thrown into prison. But as we pulled up to the gates of the school or the church, our driver beeped his horn, and Perry showed him quickly, made him hush, because he didn't want to draw any attention from the neighborhood to the fact that we were going into this Christian congregation. While we were there, I sat on the floor with the women on the left. Tim sat on the floor with the men on the right. The pastor came down out of the chancel area and took Tim by the hand, took him up into the chancel. We didn't think too much of it because, it's a very strongly patriarchal culture, and it was very common for that to happen. But then the pastor, after a few moments, turned to Tim and said, "We are so happy today to have the Reverend Diane Fonderlin preaching for us." Now, Tim, if you know him, is a quiet man, but I'll tell you, without missing a beat, and so graciously, he turned to the pastor and said, "Pastor, I thank you for the special privilege. It's not often that I get to introduce my wife, the Reverend Diane Fonderlin." Now, Tim will tell you that he had his chance, but he missed it. This slide is from Mongolia, and We were in Darhan, which is very close to the Russian border. It was a 90-house build. Because of Mongolia's extreme weather, they have a very short building time frame, from maybe June until about the middle of August. This 90-house build, we were invited to work on the home. You'll see the 3 young men standing with Tim and I, and then another colleague. 2 are brothers, one's 16 and one's 17, and then the other boy is a cousin, a 17-year-old cousin. It was the brother's sister's home, she and her husband, who had to work. So the brothers said, we'll go work on your house while this mission team is here. This mission team we had brought from Malaysia, I might say. But they said, we'll work on the house. And so they brought a cousin along as well. The first day they were there working, the boys had a smattering of English from their schooling. It was so funny to learn that the word T-I-I-M, team, means yes in Mongolian. And when they found out Tim's name was Tim, all over the compound, we'd hear the boys hollering, team! They just thought that was the funniest thing. But they were working on laying concrete blocks. And as the boys laid the block down, Tim was mortaring on top of it. Having worked with teenagers for so many years, when the boys laid the block down, their hands still holding the block in place, Tim simply mortared right over top of their hands. Well, the boys kind of turned and looked at one another, and I'm sure they were thinking, what's with this American? They laid the next block, and sure enough, he mortared right over top of their hands again. And I tell you, like teenagers anywhere in the world, they looked at each other, they looked at Tim, game was on. And thereafter, they just delighted in working with Tim, teasing, playing. The day we were leaving, we were called into the home on which we had been working, and young Augie, he's the young fellow there with the hat, the tallest young fellow with the hat on, 16 years old, presented this musical instrument. It's called a murin kur, hand-carved. I don't know that you can see very well, but there's a horse head at the top of it. That's very commonplace, and the strings on it and the strings on the bow are made with horse's hair. Typically placed above the doorway, entryway door to the house, and means well-being, prosperity, in some ways a bit like the Hebrew shalom. And so young Augie had begun carving this murin kur 2 months earlier, and when we came in, we were there for 10 days, he hurriedly finished it up and was able to present it to Tim. And now, after all our many years in the mission field, we were able to place it above our home in Ohio, above the doorway in our home in Ohio. This is Emperon, Indonesia. This is actually Banda Aceh, Indonesia, which was the worst hit site of all homes, of all nations, following the 2006 Indian Ocean tsunami. This village, Emperon, had a village headman who had lost, Tim, how many? 6 children and his wife. In this village, this compound, wherever you could look 180 degrees, or I'm sorry, 360 degrees, and see absolutely nothing. The blessing was that with Tim being there, we being there as global ministries, missionaries, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, of which we are a part, the United Church of Christ, the Brethren Church, and I have forgotten the 4th church, each donated $250,000, $1 million, and they had Tim pick the site where they would rebuild. In the village where they were, there were 23 families before the tsunami hit. Of the 23 families, 21 lost the mothers, the wives, in that village. Tim was with a team, and they were talking to the families, and they learned that one of the two remaining women was a newlywed. And they discovered, the team that Tim was with, discovered that she and the other young woman were doing all of the laundry and all of the cooking for all 23 families. And one of the team members asked her, or said to the newlywed, well, you're a newlywed. I mean, don't you have to take care of your own husband, your own household? And the young woman looked at them kind of befuddled, and she said, if we don't do it, who does? We're always learning. We're always learning. If we don't do it, who does? I think these last two slides tell my favorite stories, my favorite experiences from all the years that Tim and I were overseas. This is the seminary graduation class that was held during my third year. I taught in our partner, Conus Bay. I taught in their seminary school. This was the third year, so this was the class right before the last year's class of which I was a part. The students that I worked with came to class on Saturday morning. Now you have to understand, weather is about 87 to 94 degrees average. We had no electricity. There were no fans. There were no lights. The walls were concrete. We had no window panes in the windows, just rebar in the windows. The acoustics were simply terrible as far as speaking without any type of technical amplification. And the students would come in, and as the day went on, it would get hot. And if it had rained too heavily, we would have puddles of rain throughout our classroom, having to move our desk kind of to brush away what water we could. And those students would sit there, and some would begin to fall asleep. Initially, when I began teaching, a couple of them would fall asleep in class. And I learned that by falling asleep, it was because the night before they had stayed awake for an all-night prayer vigil. That's very common in churches, Protestant churches in Haiti, all-night prayer vigils. And so I learned, too, that most of the pastors did not have Bibles, and yet they knew Scripture. They could quote it in a way that we, as Americans, simply cannot. Their hunger, their thirst for knowledge, part of my work in teaching church history was to give them a context for Scripture, for the Bible, and the history that wraps around it. I just was humbled beyond measure to work with people so committed and so hungry for God's Word. And then this last photo. This baby girl is from Sri Lanka. I met her when she was about 7 months old. After the tsunami, Tim and I were living in Malaysian Borneo at the time, but we were called back Tim was called back to Sri Lanka because he knew the country to help with a special house build project, 123 houses. I would go and visit him periodically, and while I was there, the men were off looking at house construction, and I was left just standing around, and a woman came out onto her porch, and she had this baby in her arms, and I was just so taken with the beauty of the baby. Her eyelashes were about an inch long, and I was thinking to myself, we women here in the U.S., we paid a lot of money to get those kinds of eyelashes. And so I said to Mama, may I take a picture of your baby? And like most proud mamas, she encouraged me to do so. And as I took the baby's picture, Mama started to tell me a little bit about her. She had been born a few days before the 2006 Boxing Day. That's the day after Christmas, before the Boxing Day tsunami. She was in her home tending to her newborn when she heard all kinds of screams and shouts and pounding feet, and she ran out onto her porch. And in that moment, her home was perhaps from here to the next building over. I don't know if that's the chapel or not far away. That's how close the Indian Ocean was. The tsunami wave came in, and before she could react, the baby was ripped, a newborn baby was ripped out of her arms and carried off. In the meantime, the mother's fighting for her own life. A man is in a palm tree a distance away, and as he's up at the top of that palm tree, here comes a baby on top of a crest of the wave. And he reached out and plucked the baby and pulled her into safety. He was able to safely get her back to her mother within a few days. And I tell that story because in all of our work in mission, the many years we were in mission, friends, I tell you, God is still at work in this world. God is still bringing his miracles. I believe that I'm preaching on you now. He's still calling us to be his salt and his light in this world. Tim and I absolutely believe that mission needs a face to it. We need face-to-face because people have so many different or misperceptions, not only from countries, hosting countries, but from those of us who go there. Going to Bangladesh, I was convinced as an American that, man, if you work hard enough, you can get far. You can get ahead. All you have to do is dig in pull yourself up by the bull straps, or the shoulder straps. I lost the bootstraps. Thank you. I lost the slang there, but it's not true. We met people who would work their fingers to the bone, and given if they were in a caste system, could never pull themselves out of it. So it certainly changed our perception. And people saying to Tim and I, "You don't seem like Americans." We don't. Well, you're not loud, and you're not pushy, and you're not arrogant. In fact, you seem very Asian. What a compliment. God's world is great, His creation is beautiful, and He is still working. Thank you, friends.